Welcome to Managing Love Intelligently. I'm Jason.
And I'm Stephen Ng, marriage and family therapist.
How this works is I present a topic to Steve, which I planned ahead of time, but Steve has no idea about, and we talk about it for an hour or so. Today's topic is fair fighting.
Ooh.
So before we kick off the conversation, if you have a question for Steve, visit stevening.com and fill out the contact form. At the end of each episode, Steve will answer your listener questions, so stay tuned for that. If you enjoy the podcast, please subscribe, share it with your friends and family. And if you really enjoy the podcast, please consider leaving a review. We are here to have open conversations. We don't have all the answers, but we are helping people think more intelligently about love. Is that
You're asking me now? We're like, what, 30, 40 episodes deep in this? Yeah, that's why we're here, for crying out loud. Yeah, of course.
All right. So fair fighting. It's kind of nuts that we never talked about this. I mean, we've brushed it, but we've never made it a full topic. So
it's really crazy.
Growing up, I thought fighting in relationships was bad, which I know a lot of people do. I held this belief because when there was fighting in the home, and there wasn't a lot, thankfully, but during the few times there was, it came out in like this big, loud, explosive display that was quite traumatizing for like a kid. So you see that and you're like, man, I don't want to do that. So that kind of ingrained in my brain, at least, okay, fighting is bad because it wasn't pleasant. So then you kind of avoid it. So at least I did. So then, and I've had 3 relationships, 2 5-year relationships, 1 3-year relationship. And all throughout all of them, I think I avoided it as much as I possibly could. And it really didn't do anyone any good. And I think that avoidance resulted in pain, disconnect, and hurt for kind of everyone. And I didn't know about fair fighting until in my late 30s when I, started doing marketing stuff for you and learning about this stuff. And I probably heard it maybe in passing or read some things, but I really wasn't. I was one of those people who thought I knew how to have a relationship, even though I was failing all the time. So it's like finally at the last one was so painful. I was like, okay, I need to.
Now you're very open-minded.
I'm very open-minded. I got the message. I'm not doing something after 3. I'm missing something here. So then learning about fair fighting and seeing it now as a necessary skill in order to manage love intelligently. So with that kind of long-winded intro, which I wanted to share because I think a lot of people have that experience. I think we've talked about that, where they see it from their parents and they don't want to do it and they kind of avoid it. But you have this thing called fair fighting. So we could start by having you kind of explaining what that is, and then maybe like how you came up with it and all that sort of stuff.
Sure. I think this is going to be super helpful. So if you are listening to this, you may want to listen to it a couple of times. And I would encourage you to talk about the content a little bit. Whether you're mentioning my name or not is not the issue. It's really a big idea that sometimes people don't see big ideas because they are discussed in easy to understand ways. I think I'm not the first therapist to say virtually everything that's going wrong in our lives ultimately seems to go back to our childhood. So all these therapy issues, there are a few that are just really current events only, but mostly the difficulties we're having with these problems do go back. And I grew up with some traumatic fights in my history between my 2 parents. And for me, I made that same simple calculation you did, that fighting is bad. And then now to the point where, it's almost like a joke, right, out of a cartoon strip. I hate it when mommy and daddy fight. And that even if we're disagreeing about where to go for dinner on a night out on the town, it's like cringe because we have to have a conflict. But for those listening to this, I'm going to say it's the kind of fighting that we're talking about in this episode is not the knockdown, drag out, law of the jungle kind of fighting where might makes right and the person who out yells the other person wins, or that by some, feat of verbal acuity or dexterity or whatever the right word is, I dominate the conversation and I out argue the other person until they're verbally beaten into submission and I get to have my way. Mm-hmm. Fighting in the
and you've actually really quick had physical abuse too.
Oh gosh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Given and received. So I think when we talk about fair fighting, it's based on the concept that anytime any two people get close, there's always going to be some degree of conflict eventually. It's simply a matter of reason, because from a phenomenological point of view, we're all seeing the world from a different perspective, quite literally. I'm sitting a few feet apart from you, looking in one direction, you're looking in the opposite direction at me, and we see and experience this room in a different way, and this conversation in a different way. So imagine that over a lifetime, day in, day out, two people sharing their lives with each other. How could they not have differing perspectives and different solutions and even a perception of different problems in the relationship? It's absolutely unthinkable that wouldn't occur. So the question is not whether or not there's going to be fighting. It's whether or not that fighting is going to be productive. And in order for it to be truly productive, it has to be about resolving problems, problem solving. I wouldn't necessarily say resolving conflicts, because some conflicts, if I married the wrong person and she likes sex once every 6 months and I like sex a lot more frequently than that, there's no amount of conversation or arguing that's going to resolve that. Sometimes you just have to admit, oops, we made a mistake, and then you move on. But when we talk about conflict, I think people would be well served by memorizing a simple statement that conflict is an essential and inevitable part of every intimate relationship. And I'm going to say that one more time. Conflict is an essential and inevitable part of every intimate relationship. So,
have you ever had someone really quick say, well, you're doing it wrong?
No, I haven't had anybody say that. But if you think about the non-intimate relationships, like, the mailman who drops off my mail, or the clerk at the grocery store who rings up my groceries, I don't have conflicts with them. Because there's no intimacy at all. We may be friendly and chatty and all of that with each other, but there's really nothing to fight about. And there's no real conflict of interests there. But I'm not a mind reader. And if I'm living with somebody who is also not a mind reader, she and I can't really suss out what the other person is thinking, wanting, and needing every minute of every day. So it's inevitable that we're going to make mistakes thinking, oh, I really know her, so of course she wants a vacuum cleaner for Christmas. And that's probably not going to ever be true of any woman. I'm sure I'll get some letters on that one. But it seems to me that if we can just accept, unlike the child who's trying to avoid all conflict, just accept that it's a perfectly normal. And what makes it acceptable is that it's civilized. It's more like a meeting of a board of directors that is presided over in a very calm and businesslike way, where, the production of our corporation, she and I together make up this corporation where we've joined forces with one another to solve life's problems and share our lives and overcome those problems by virtue of what we have shared with one another. I think that if with those rules in mind, the first principle has to be no abuse. So there are 3 simple rules, and the first one is no abuse. But even saying that, I have to say that very simple rule is so confusing to people, because people who have been in the habit of talking down to their spouse, they don't see that as abuse.
Yeah, because you have a whole, can we go through kind of like what you
Yeah,
would say, like,
sure.
you even say eye rolling, like, and I would say sometimes my last relationship, when I would say, can we talk about something? It's like an eye roll and like, again, we talk about this and nothing ever gets resolved. It's
right.
Like,
so yeah, any expression of contempt would be abuse, I think, because it's not respectful. Mm-hmm. So, and I've been guilty of being abusive in this way in relatively small ways, but I think acknowledging that, accepting responsibility for it, and saying that verbally. The other day, I talked down to you and in a demeaning tone of voice. I want you to know I'm really sorry. Mm-hmm. And to be able to own it means that we can get better at having truly respectful relationships. Because then what's great about that is we're not activating the amygdala. So we're able to think really clearly instead of going into fight or flight mode. And as we're thinking clearly and speaking clearly, we become more open-minded to possible solutions we ourselves might not have considered. Mm-hmm. So with abuse out of the way, and it's something that we've made a deep commitment to, we're not going to be abusive with each other. I'm not going to try to control her in areas that are her life, her domain. I'm not going to try to control her life, her hairstyle or her wardrobe or the kind of music she likes to listen to, and or the kind of friends she wants to have in her life. But in a similar way, I have all of those freedoms too. Mm-hmm. And they are, I think any attempt to control one another in those areas would be an example of what Gandhi called an act of violence. Any attempt, he said, to impose my will upon another is an act of violence. It's a bit of an exaggeration in literal terms, but I think it's an act of violence metaphorically in the sense that I'm stepping into your domain. I've invaded your domain, and it's your kingdom where you get to decide, what kind of shoes you're going to wear on a given day. Mm-hmm. And if I look at you and I make a face and I say something like, "Oh, you're going to wear those shoes?" Yeah. I mean, there is an act of contempt there. There's an attempt to control the other person. And it is, I think, in Gandhi's sense, I think he was right, that it is an act of violence because I'm really stepping out of my own domain into your domain. I've invaded your space.
You're stepping into their shoes.
Or on them. Yeah. But with that rule in place, then we've kind of created a blank canvas where it's at least safe. I know I can go into this conversation knowing I'm not going to be yelled at. I'm not going to be called a name. I'm not going to be put down. And that is that blank canvas that we need to begin getting creative on. And the next...
But really quick on that.
Sure.
But just even people recognizing their own abusive behaviors, I would imagine, would be quite difficult for some people to even admit or to even, why?
No, you're so right. I'm glad you slowed me down on that because it's such a paradigm shift for all of us, in our country. And I think around the world, human cultures have been guilty of normalizing a certain level of violence.
Yeah, all the time. I think people are,
a certain level of abuse.
Yeah, politics, for instance, which is a very easy example. Both sides abuse each other in different ways.
Horribly.
And it just becomes normalized. And
even in comedies, romantic comedies, which are one of my favorite art forms, but there's often a put down here and there that is really abusive. Mm-hmm. And it's said for laughs or it's said as part of the drama, and I get that. But we normalize this stuff to our own great risk because it is not normal. It is not normal to say, on the one hand, I love you more than I've ever loved anyone else. You mean the world to me. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. And then months later to follow that up with some put down or name calling. Mm-hmm. That just makes no sense, much less yelling, screaming at each other.
Yeah.
So, it's, pick a side. It's one or the other. And if you really do love someone, that's not a loving behavior. Mm-hmm. So to acknowledge that and it's rather huge. And it, frankly, again, I think an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure here, because it's a whole lot better to see if the other person can really commit to an abuse-free way of life with one another before a marriage than waiting afterwards to check it out.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I always think people who are dating, they need to experience what is it like to have at least 3 conflicts with the other person, at least 3.
Yeah.
Where it's a heartfelt disagreement about politics or about lifestyle choices or fashion or whatever a hot button issue might be for somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Religion comes to mind. And to have the argument and to see if it can still be respectful.
Yeah.
Instead of, well, you always say things like that. I can't believe you believe that. That's borderline abusive, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it's the tone of voice but on the other hand, I really don't want to encourage everybody to think that I'm talking about all of us who are in love with one another speaking in a robotic way or always being, with no inflection in our voice, because I think it's human to be angry sometimes. It's human to be angry, but can we be angry without abuse?
Mm.
Can we be hurt without abuse? Can we be feeling any kind of passionate feeling without getting abuse? Well, I think that is possible. It's just that we're not taught how to do that. And it takes a minute to figure that out. So,
yeah. And sometimes you get it and you're like, oh, man, she's right. Or, because again, it's so normalized in our society and you just don't even, I don't know, you're not even, when you're not aware of it, it kind of just blends in the background and becomes a thing. And you're not even aware that it's kind of destroying your intimacy and your ability to create a safe relationship and your love. It's like chipping away.
Well, okay, so the classic example in my office is a man or woman say, well, yeah, but if she, or in a woman's case, if I am acting like a bitch, isn't it okay if he calls me a bitch or says, stop acting like a bitch? And I would say, absolutely not. And it isn't okay because it is a put down and it is name calling. Just like, perhaps a woman would be tempted to call you or me a wimp or something like that, or you're not a real man, or if you were a real man, you would do this. And there may be, in our own hearts, we may have doubts about ourselves. We may think we're too passive or we're often too wimpy for our own taste. But that doesn't give the other person, if there's a germ of truth in that, in terms of our perception of ourselves, it does not give the other person the right to abuse us with name calling and put downs.
Well, I think they think that I think they believe that abuse equals love too, because that's how they, what I'm saying by that.
No, and nor does anyone else.
Well, for instance, one time I had an ex-girlfriend say to me, when we argue, you should yell at me. You should yell.
Because if you love, you would care enough to yell. Yeah. I see what you mean.
And it's like, that is like, it's like, wait, what? It's like, I don't think we need to do that.
I actually did date a woman who said that. Yeah. And I've had plenty of men in my office who've said the same thing. Well, you obviously don't care about your wife if you wouldn't, get mad and yell at her if she was doing something so very offensive to your morals or your ethics. Yeah, I see what you're saying. And it's just that, no, I believe even an angry person can have an angry tone without yelling at his spouse or her spouse. I think we can communicate any of the dissatisfactions or unhappiness in our lives with just simple language and even a tone of voice. I can have an angry tone of voice in saying whatever I say without getting abusive. And I need the wiggle room to be human in that way. Mm-hmm. But this is like its own conversation in and of itself, right? Yeah. We're talking about conflict in relationships and normalizing this and how do we fight, and fair fighting is the theme of this hour together.
Yeah.
And the abuse-free life is step one.
Yeah. And then, but I'm really quick on that before we move on to the next step of fair fighting. What do people, from your experience, once they understand what you're saying, do they then absorb it, or they fight it?
Oh,
Or
the how to when it comes to abuse.
Well, as far as like these are the abusive behaviors, and then it's like the bitch thing or any other example you get from a client, are people being like, oh, that is like, do they understand it, or are they still like?
So far, I've been pretty successful in teaching people that it is abusive and why it's abusive.
So they're able to see it.
Yeah, because I give a very vulgar example you've heard me use before. Even if your grandmother did give your grandfather oral sex, would it be okay to call her a cocksucker? Mm-hmm. And they, oh yeah, no, that wouldn't be okay. That would be horrible. And so I don't want to do that. That's why it wouldn't be okay to call your husband a wimp, or for him to call his wife a bitch, even if there's some degree of truth from some personal perspective there. It's still name calling. And I was very humbled one time when I was dating a woman before I got married. And I said, you're really being a poor sport about this. Mm-hmm. And she fell silent. And I realized, oh my God, I just got abusive of her. Mm-hmm. And I confronted it, and I said, I'm sorry. I said you were a poor sport. I apologize. Mm. And she very quietly said, as if under a lot of trauma, she said, I thought it was abusive. But I thought if I confront him, he's just going to wiggle his way out of it and somehow make it okay. Yeah. Which really broke my heart, to hear her say that, because I really wish I were that clever. Yeah. I wish I were so clever I could talk myself out of the obvious fault. But the truth is, there is no way out of that. It's just even a relatively mild put down, like calling somebody a poor sport. That's still a put down. Mm-hmm. So to say any of those things, I think for those of us who've had a bad habit developed over many years, it feels really weird, like we're being super sensitive to start living this life of abuse-free living. But I would encourage the listeners out there to be thinking in terms of an ounce of caution is going to be really good here, because we've all been misunderstood. Even when we were joking and we said something in our own mind, thinking she's going to find this hilarious, and it wasn't hilarious. She was offended. I think we need to be hyper careful about making sure we're establishing a truly safe relationship. Yeah. Cool. So step one, no abuse. Yeah. Fair fighting. And that's so easy, right? It's so easy for me to say, but obviously very hard to execute. Well, it's one of those things in like any like teaching, like Buddhism, like be present. It's like, got it. Enough. Got it. But then it's like, to actually practice that is nearly impossible. I mean, unless it's very challenging. It's very hard. Yeah. And it's something that you work on for your life, and the abuse-free life and the no abuse stuff is also a same thing, because like you say, every once in a while you will cross the line and become abusive. Yeah. And then you have to own it, acknowledge it. And it's like a practice, like you're practicing being this no abuse lifestyle. Well, and for the individual listening, whether they are or aren't in a couple right now, I would encourage them to do an exercise I do with my clients, where I ask them to just keep a daily log of how many times they were abusive with their spouse, and maybe just some one-word examples of like put down, or controlled her grooming, or attacked his taste in music, or whatever it is. And that over a month, we can chart to that and take a look at, if the newcomer to this kind of thinking is going to rate their level of abuse at a 10 right now, because that's their highest level. And then in their relationship, they make an effort to reduce that. What you should see over time is it falling over. If you're good-hearted and relatively intelligent, you could probably get down to 0 within a few weeks, even a month or two. But then there will be a time where you're at 0 from a 10, and then there'll be a little spike. And usually the spike won't go up to a 10. It'll go up to something significantly less. And what you'll see, if you take responsibility for that abuse, is that you get back on track with living the abuse-free life, and then there'll be like another spike, only it'll start looking like the EKG of a patient who's slowly dying, because the spikes, which would normally be a heartbeat, only in this case it's abuse, the spikes will get shorter and shorter and farther apart. And so obviously what I'm talking about is very much like Buddha's talking about skills. Living life skillfully includes not abusing the sentient creatures around you, including animals, right? I don't want to be abusing animals. So it's a personal challenge, but I think it makes one's life so much more sane and so much more reasonable. And it also really highlights when you start dating somebody, if you're single and you start dating somebody and you ask them about their relationship history and they're telling you, well, why didn't that work out? And they mention something about the other person always yelling, or, well, what did you do when they were yelling? And well, I tried to yell back, but he would never listen. Or, well, then okay, that they have a history of abuse, and frankly, we all do. And then especially if you include guilt trips, looking at you, religious people, and if you go on to date the same person, you get to say, well, would you ever be interested in an abuse-free lifestyle with another person? And that's the first step, again, on the road to fair fighting. So if we've dealt with fair fighting enough to satisfy your insatiable curiosity about no abuse.
We have.
Okay.
So we can move on to number 2, step 2.
Finally, we can go on to number 2. Number 2 is really pretty elementary compared to number 1, because it's fighting by mutual consent. And that means that there's a semi-formal sort of introduction, like, hey, I have a bone to pick with you. Is now a good time? So, instead of those drive-by arguments where I just mouth off to somebody, I've got my hand on the door and I'm stepping out to go to work, and I'm saying, by the way, your mother's and I say something horrible about her mother, and I never want to see her again. And, I've kind of opened the door to a conversation, but then I've slammed it shut as I slam the door of the house and go to work. And in the same way, it's, if the whole goal of being in a relationship is to put an end to loneliness and to live happily ever after, that's not a very good strategy for resolving conflict, just to throw a hand grenade and walk away. So I think by mutual consent means there's an invitation, a proposal. I'd like to have an argument with you right now, which sounds really odd to our ear, right? Because usually
you just get into it.
Yeah, we just get into it. Like, I hate it when you cook this shit, And
oh, you're always on me with this.
Yeah, you're always. How come you can never be on time? You're always late. Instead of going with one of those, to say, and to pick a day we're getting along for that invitation. I have a bone to pick with you, or I have something I need to talk to you about. Is this a good time? And a very honest and fair answer would be, actually not. I'm too tired, or I'm just too hungry. I need to eat something first. And that's just very human. And I don't think that's avoidant. I think it's just very human for people to want to put themselves in the best possible mental space by getting their rest. Maybe if it means like turning down an opportunity to have an argument just before bedtime, so be it. Because we can schedule that conflict in our very next day or our next weekend. And that's what boards of directors do. They schedule meetings, they schedule an agenda, and then they come together because, it's not about immediate gratification, and it's not about yelling. It's really about solving the problem so we can go forward with maximizing our happiness. So arguments only occur by mutual consent. And when that gets forgotten, and I've been in dating relationships where that does get forgotten.
Where they do just say, what the hell's wrong with you?
Yeah. And I'll say, oh, did you want to have a conflict?
Yeah.
Or did you want to have an argument?
Mm-hmm.
And for them to look at me, or did you want to have a fight? And those are not dirty words for me anymore. As long as they're civilized,
Mm-hmm.
and not by the rule of the jungle.
Yes. Would you like to have a fight with me today?
Yeah, like asking for some Grey Poupon. And so, and usually that's enough to remind the other person, oh yeah, that's right, I made a commitment to fair fighting. And
so there's a commitment to fair that you just said.
Absolutely. I mean, before I ever got into any kind of committed relationship, I would want that commitment. And my wife and I have made that commitment to each other before we even got together in a committed relationship. She was excited about it, and rightfully so, because I'm bigger than she is. So I can yell louder. And so if we were, if it was the law of the jungle, I might prevail. But when it has to be civilized, then
it's equal.
Yeah, it's really much more based on equality. And it's really so much better for me because I'm ultimately far happier with good problem solving technique. So by mutual consent, I hope that's pretty straightforward and pretty clear to people.
I had a question though too, like how, say something happens that you are annoyed with or that bothered you, like do you address, hey, there's something we need to talk about? Do you give it some time? Like say the incident occurs, do you immediately then say, hey, I have a bone to pick with you? Or do you like give it, or is it good to like give it a few?
Well, sometimes if I understood you right, sometimes there's a conflict where, for example, one of us is getting interrupted too many times, or even just once, let's say, and once is too many times to interrupt someone in a polite conversation. So if I confront or am confronted by the other person and say, hey, I was talking and I need you to not interrupt me, for me to say, yeah, I did, I'm sorry. And then we move along. So, but what if it's done repeatedly on the night her parents come over, let's say, and I choose to not make a big deal out of it because, her parents are there. I just want to enjoy the evening. And it's a relatively small issue. It's not an ongoing thorn in my side. So we could go ahead and talk about it this weekend or the next day. And I would do that. Hey, I want to talk to you about something that happened last night. And for her to say, and I would say, is this a good time? And usually by time, I mean, I need usually like a half an hour to an hour to at least introduce the subject and possibly resolve it. But if we don't resolve it, then we can reschedule to continue the conversation as far as the following week. Like if my spending habits are out of hand and she's really concerned about our finances, I can at least say, well, look, I'm not going to spend any money this week, but we need to talk about this some more. Can we get together next weekend and talk about this?
Yeah,
absolutely. So we can talk about it and talk about it and talk about it until we find a solution that's mutually acceptable. And again, if we can't, that's kind of a foundational issue, money. If I'm insisting on spending money we don't have, there's no solving that. It's probably time for my partner to move on because I'm always going to be putting our family into this unacceptable level of financial drama. Yeah. So I hope that's clear. There's a lot of room for immediate gratification if it's a small topic. If it's a weightier subject that's really under people's skin and bothering them in an irksome sort of way, then we may need to schedule some more time. But I don't really think anybody has any problems they need to argue 3 hours straight for. Yeah, that's too much. I just my mind wanders, and arguing is hard work. I mean, if we're arguing in good faith and we're trying to problem solve, that's a challenging mental effort for some really hard problems. So what are we going to do about that? And well, I think rescheduling it and continuing on, because we're not talking about a 911 call. This is not an emergency. It may be very important and it may be something I feel very passionate about, but generally we have the luxury of weeks and weeks of time we could talk it over.
So like a half hour, an hour is a good time frame.
Yeah. And to say, look, and we get to quit by mutual, not by mutual consent. Anytime one person wants to quit, then we no longer have consent for going on.
All right.
So I think that way no one is trapped and browbeaten into exhaustion. Like, okay, fine, have it your own way. That is not problem solving.
Yeah.
Because we really want to end up with a solution where we can both look at each other and smile and feel love for each other and be happy, that it's really going to work. And if we can't figure that out, then it's really one person dominating another person.
Yeah.
Another technique that couples can use, and this is not original with me, but I like the trial offer, so I can propose, look, I don't know what the right solution is, but what do you say for the next 30 days we try this? Mm-hmm. And we get together a month from today, we circle the date, and we'll get together and talk about whether it's working or not. Mm. And if there are no better ideas on the table, then most of us have to surrender to the idea of trying an idea we haven't tried, seeing if it works. And it's not rigid. It's like if it's horribly working, like in the first week or two, then just because I don't have the checkbook with me doesn't mean I can't spend money. I can still break out a credit card or something. Mm-hmm. So if I'm continuing to spend, then that's not going to work.
Yeah.
So I hope that's very clear.
Yeah. And you're saying if they could test out the fair fighting for a month.
Oh,
and see if that's
even the fair fighting, that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Let's just try it for a month while we're dating and see how that works for you. Or for a married couple, let's just try it. Let's see how life goes without yelling and screaming at each other. and you might like it. You never know. I mean, not everybody is from New Jersey. Mm-hmm. So it might be okay. And there is a last step.
Yes.
So there are these 3 rules for fair fighting. No abuse, by mutual consent. And the last one is any one subject. Any one subject means we can talk about anything, but please, for the love of all that is sacred, just one thing at a time. That's how I say it to my wife. Because, honey, I'm just a man. I know you women are capable of multitasking, but I am not. I just need to focus on solving one problem at a time. Mm-hmm. And usually if I say it in a cute enough way, my wife laughs and she agrees to limit it to that one thing. But what typically happened at your family or in mine growing up was one person would complain about one thing and the other person would fight fire with fire. Well, what about your mother? And then they'd go on fighting that way back and forth. Or
they like match the energies.
Yeah. That's what passed for the problem solving. Mm-hmm. When, surprise, surprise, there was no problem solving because my unhappiness matches your unhappiness. Yeah. And therefore, by the transitive property of misery, there is no misery anymore.
Yeah. And the problem was solved by like a really hard sort of, like it led to like get divorced or like an extreme reaction.
Right.
Like it led to like an extreme negative
Pack
reaction.
Pack their bags,
move out, or whatever it may be.
Then there'd be the phone call and maybe they'd make up or maybe they wouldn't. But in the meantime, there's so much drama. And of course, everybody who's listened to this regularly knows that by drama, I mean the needless escalation of a problem. If the problem is I spend too much, or at least in her mind, I spend too much, yelling and screaming at her needlessly escalates that problem into a new problem. Yeah. And my grabbing a suitcase and, going home to mother or wherever it is I go, that is, again, another needless escalation of a problem, as would be her slamming the door on my way out and say, don't ever darken this door again. It's all like more and more and more drama. And this, if you live by these rules for a while, you kind of get ruined by them because you're useless for these high drama events. Mm-hmm. Because really what the drama does is it totally obscures the actual true problem, and it makes thinking about problem solving virtually impossible. Mm-hmm. I mean, the odds against a really thoughtful, solution coming out of that kind of atmosphere are virtually nil. So these are the only 3 rules you need. I'm kind of, in terms of my own contribution to the world's understanding of how to problem solve, these 3 rules are my contribution. No abuse, by mutual consent, any one subject. And they're all essential. They all matter. And but I don't think any of us need any rules other than those 3.
Yeah. Well, I like how it's so simple, but I was going to say too, well, what about people? Because I feel like people are living this way or living maybe in a high drama state. They apply this rule of fair fighting, 3 steps for a month, and then that lowers the drama. But then they're like, well, now I'm bored.
Yeah. And that's a really great thing to bring up, because for a lot of people, the energy around fighting is just a pleasing, bright and shiny distraction rolling across the floor, where the real problem is I'm unhappy in my life and it's boring, mm-hmm. or it's unsatisfying, maybe is a better word. It's unfulfilling. And at least when I'm arguing, I feel like I'm doing something about it, when actually I'm engaged in doing nothing about it. I might as well be yelling at myself in the mirror.
Yeah.
So yeah, that would be kind of important. And then there's that other side that we talked about before, that, well, if he's not yelling at me, then he obviously doesn't care. Mm-hmm. When the reality is, yeah, maybe he doesn't care, but or maybe he's even avoidant of conflict, and he thinks if he doesn't ever if he never responds to your yelling, that he's somehow reducing the conflict. But what if he just responded with, look, I'd love to solve this problem, and frankly, this problem means a lot more to me than you may think, but I want to solve it because I do love you and I do care about you. Mm-hmm. But we're not going to solve it if we're just yelling at each other. So I need you to remember the commitment we made to an abuse-free lifestyle and an abuse-free relationship with each other. And frankly, my dear, you owe me an apology for yelling at me. Mm. And then she gets even more upset, and she yells at you, when actually she could say, you're right, and I'm not ready to apologize right now, but I am ready to stop yelling. Is that good enough? And you would probably say, yes, I know I would. Mm-hmm. And I would say, yeah, that'd be a great first step. And tell you what, why don't you take a minute to compose yourself, and let's figure out a good time for us to have a nice fight. Mm-hmm. And maybe it's after dinner, but I don't recommend people fight after dinner because it's just too short of a period of time. Mm-hmm. And our brains are busy sending all the blood down to our gut to be able to digest the food. And I don't recommend people argue just before bed. I think that's a horrible time to argue. But, on the weekend, or when we have a time that we're both rested and fed, possibly after brunch on a weekend day. Or I'm going to say something that is blasphemous, but maybe just mentally getting ready for the day, but not going to church that day because we have such an important conflict.
How dare you?
Another thing I would recommend to people, if they really want to fight, would you be willing to give up? They say, I really want to fight, but there is no good time. Would you be willing to give up your favorite TV show? And if some people are just married to their TV shows, or whatever else it is that they do. Mm-hmm. And that's just unacceptable, that any of those pastimes or hobbies become more important than our relationship.
Yeah.
If that's true, then I think it's time to, call it a day and move on with your life.
Yeah. And what would you say about like the benefits of this? Like we talk about intimacy a lot, which is the ability to safely share your life with your partner.
Right.
I think if you do fair fighting, because intimacy, you say, is, well, you could say it better than I can. There's 2 parts that create a relationship: the titillation and the intimacy, like the physical attraction.
Well, a sexual relationship. Yeah, I mean, I have to think she's hot, smoking hot.
Yeah.
And on my way to the bedroom, or as I would call it, the smoke show, I also
I
need
know you said, "Welcome to the smoke show."
I also need to be able to share who I am,
Mhm.
and to be able to talk about my thoughts, feelings, ideas, and yes, fantasies and all the rest of it. It's all there's no part of me that's unacceptable
But you need to do
in
that
that
in a
moment.
safe way, and then in order to sustain a long-term committed relationship, like, you need to, this is what sustains it, like, that safety. So and
Right.
if you're not doing the fair fighting, you're not engaging in that intimacy. But if you are doing the fair fighting, you're able to go way deeper into the realms of the relationship than you would ever reach if you stay fighting. It's like, you want to have better sex, fair fight. It's like,
Yeah.
you want to have bad sex, maybe sometimes it's good or you think it's good, fight and yell and scream and have your makeup sex, which you
Right. A lot
think
of
is
people
good.
swear by that,
Yeah,
right?
you think it's the best, but it's not even anywhere near it could be if you are truly intimate, truly safe, and having these discussions in a safe way,
Well, you asked
problem
me about the
solving.
benefits
Mhm.
of fair fighting, and I think certainly it goes as far as the bedroom. I mean, there's fair fighting's benefit just extends to every corner of my life and my relationship with my partner. So we can talk about money more comfortably. We can talk about the kids. We can talk about religion. We can talk about any subject under the sun, because I know, and I have a deep faith that she's never going to abuse me.
Mhm.
And she feels the same way, that I'm never going to abuse her,
Mhm.
that it doesn't matter what she says or how she feels or what she's thinking. She can just say those things freely. And as long as she's um, not abusive, I'm going to be focused on the topic. Now, this is something that may sound a little too clever or cute for some people, but for me, once we have an agreement in place for an abuse-free life, and then my partner becomes abusive, for me, there is only one subject at that time. It doesn't matter to me whether I gambled the rent away or I was doing something else that was equally upsetting. If she gets abusive, then the subject of the conversation is, I thought we had an agreement. Did you
Mhm.
want to renegotiate the
Yeah.
terms of our agreement? And, upon thinking about it, she decides. Because if we can't have an abuse free relationship, what's the point of talking about any of it?
Mhm.
Once you've experienced an abuse free relationship, there's no going back.
Yeah.
It's not like, oh, our relationship would be just so much better if we could just add a tincture of abuse,
Uh,
just a little bit of abuse, enough so that I knew you were still a real man.
yeah.
No, there's no abuse that's going to make any relationship better. And so I think, everything gets better. And in some ways, I would say things outside of the relationship get better as well, because I'm going to be free to think more clearly about my life problems, like getting that promotion at work or changing jobs or moving to a new neighborhood or leaving the hometown for a new part of the country, or whatever the solution to the problem is. I'm going to be able to think so much more clearly because I'm not clogging up the bandwidth of my
Mm.
cognitive processing with all this yelling and screaming and misery and anger and all the rest of it. I'm going to be, without committing to a new religion, I'm going to be a good Buddhist because I'm living skillfully and I'm going to be calm and collected. And I think for, the funny outcome is, my son, when he was growing up, he would look at us at the table when we would have a mild disagreement about what kind of movie we were going to watch, or where we were going to go out that evening, and he would make the joke, "I hate it when mommy and daddy fight,"
Yeah.
because it was so. We got to where we were so competent good at fighting that most people would never even think we were fighting.
Mm.
They would be holding their breath, knowing, oh, the real fight is coming.
Yeah.
Because this is the preamble. This is the
Yes.
warm up. We're just pre-gaming the real fight, and it's going to
Uh-huh.
get to the yelling stage very quickly. And then we resolve the conflict, and we just go on. And
Mhm.
well, wait a minute, what just happened there? And it's because we've had these rules in place for so long, and we've gotten so good at building a life where we're very happy, that any kind of disagreement that comes up is really, really small stuff.
Yeah.
And because we have had all the big conflicts about all the things that would otherwise have destroyed our relationship. So, that skill of being able to resolve conflict, that's something, I mean, what a gift parents could give their children by doing something that is against the rules in most families. But I think arguing in front of the children is the most important way to teach your children how to argue properly. And if we're not arguing in front of the children in the fair fighting sense of that term, arguing, then we're really not teaching our children how to fight. I've had so many couples come to me, oh, my parents, I never saw them fight, or I knew they would fight, but they would wait for us to go to bed, and then they would fight in their bedroom. And they never learned how to fight. They too, like you and like myself, they internalized this irrational belief that conflict, arguing or fighting, whatever you call it, it's all bad and to be avoided.
Yeah.
And that's just nonsense. But even at work, if I take this skill set to work and I'm working in a corporation, let's say, or a small mom and pop operation, and I have a conflict with the way I'm being treated at work, or the failure to adequately compensate me for my work, to be able to have that conversation. And if the boss does get abusive, it's immediately apparent. Oh, okay, so we can't talk about this. No, you can talk about it all you want. You're never going to get a raise. Okay, because that really lets me know what kind of a place I'm working in.
Yeah.
Much more clearly than if I've normalized abuse and that's the way arguments go in my home.
Yeah.
I can go ahead and say, look, I'd like to have a fight with you about my wages, but I don't want it to get abusive and out of hand. And frankly, I think so many people who get abusive right out of the gate, they really couldn't handle it if the other person got abusive right back. It's really a matter of bullying. And the question is, I don't want to have to go through bullying and then fighting back like that in the same manner every time I think I deserve a raise.
Yeah.
I would just need to shove off and either start my own business or go to work for somebody else.
Yeah. Cool. Well, let's wrap it up there with fair fighting, and we'll end with a listener question. And if you have a question for Steve, visit stevening.com and fill out the contact form. And this week's question actually pertains to, not exactly, but definitely a part of it. So
fair fighting adjacent.
Hi, Steve. Why do you think it's so hard to get people on board with your abuse-free relationship concept?
Oh, yeah, that is very adjacent.
And what are your tips to help this not be such a hard sell for my girlfriend?
Oof.
So,
wow. Okay. So the reason I say oof is just that feeling, of someone, male or female, being so earnest and really wanting to build a relationship worth having, where all of us would say, yeah, I want it to be safe. No, I don't want to be yelled at. No, I don't want to be called names. Are you crazy? But we don't discuss it. We don't actually negotiate that as a part of the terms of the relationship. And so the person who's dealing with this and is experiencing it as a hard sell, I have nothing but compassion. It's sort of, there's so much pain involved in that. It's really heartbreaking to hear of another person going through that. But frankly, I think there are billions of people going through that right now across the world.
Yeah.
So when we talk about selling the idea of the abuse-free life, I think it's hard because it's such a simple concept, and people tend to think they understand it. Like your example with Buddhism saying, just be present. That's, well, Okay, can it be that simple? I don't think so. I'm looking for nirvana. Hello. You know,
But that's where it is. It's in the present moment.
right?
It's
And
like,
and so
that's where it is with the abuse-free life.
yeah, I think the most important truths are simple.
Mm-hmm.
And if you really understand a topic, you can break it down to simple truths.
Yeah.
And one of my pet peeves is going to look at relationship books in the bookstore. And if you follow this 300-page guide with these 47 steps, you too could have a successful relationship.
Uh-huh.
And that's nonsense. We're a social species. We should be really good at this. And we could be really good at it almost out of the gate if we could just all agree to not hit each other, yell at each other, scream at each other, put each other down. If we would stop attacking each other and realize we're on the same side here. We're both part of a group, a couple, or a family trying to build happiness. That's all we're doing here. that is the practice. That is the process. That is the goal. It's everything. Can we just be happy in our life with each other? But it's almost so simple and so elementary. I think there are other reasons, of course, and I think a lot of men and women have a hard time admitting that they've ever been abusive.
Mm-hmm.
And if I could be not sexist, but sexist adjacent here, perhaps, a generalization, I think, is that men in general are used to being criticized more on this topic, I think, and they're more used to owning, yeah, that was out of line. I was abusive. Mm-hmm. I shouldn't have spoken to her that way. And I'm not saying every guy, but I'm just saying in general, I've noticed it's really hard for women to acknowledge they've been abusive. And I think that's because of a narrative in our culture that says men are the wife beaters, men are the ones who are abusive, men are the villains when it comes to domestic conflict, and men just need to get a clue. No, I think it's actually a sport. Abuse is a sport engaged in by everyone. It's like pickleball.
Yeah.
It's for everybody, young and old, male and female. Yeah. Everybody can play. It's just that it does no one any good.
Yeah. So just admit it. Admit that you are abusive or you have been abusive.
Yeah. And then
because I have, I mean, you have. It's like,
yeah. And it's such an ugly word too. I think a lot of us want to minimize it and say, well, maybe I was a little out of line. Or maybe I shouldn't have said that. Yeah. But really the word is abuse. And if you committed abuse, you were abusive in that episode. It doesn't mean that's who you are. It's not your identity. It doesn't define you unless you want it to.
Yeah.
And if you decide to break up because your girlfriend or boyfriend won't allow you to yell at them, you're pretty committed to abuse. You're more committed to abuse and to your own selfish gratification than you are committed to this human being you said you loved. Boy, were you wrong.
Well, all right. Well,
yeah, let's quit with that.
Quit with that. All right. Thank you for the question. And thank you all for listening. And thanks, Steve. It's great chatting. And we'll catch you all later.
You say that, though, like you're kind of bored. Thanks, Steve. It's great chatting.
Well, I think it's like the end of the conversation. And it's like winding down. It's like... And also,
no, it was great. It was great talking to you.
I loved it. I love having these conversations because I think they are, there's nothing more important, I think, than, we're on this planet, we're humans, and let's have some fun. Let's be happy. Let's how do we have successful relationships? It's like, I went through 3 relationships, like I said, and that had great moments, but also a lot of not great moments. And if I could now live in a way and have all my relationships be more fun, be more abuse free, and it's like, isn't that what we're doing?
Yeah, that's what we want to do. And for me, the whole reason I'm doing this is I'd like to do it before I mysteriously die at a prematurely early age, say 98. And I want to make sure that this legacy of this intellectual property is available for everybody so that, 20 years after I'm dead, people will say, gosh, he was just really on top of this. It's going to be so gratifying.
Yeah, you're gonna be out there in the cosmos. Finally, they get it.
All right.
All right.
Talk to you later.